thought I had, just for open, maybe just a rhetorical question to each of you, of what I learned from Colonel Ryan right there that makes me excited about what we can do as state board members and as PROC members and as peer reviewers, that many of you serve in that role as well. So at any rate, one of the things I learned is that everybody's proud of what they do, and not everybody does it in the same way. And so when we go through the slide deck, and again, it's really a facilitation, so I don't intend for us to get through all the slides. I think there's some good information there, and in fact, those of you who sat in Jim Giroux's session earlier, a lot of the things that Jim talked about in establishing a PROC, we'll cover that in the slide deck, so you can certainly use that as reference. There's a lot of resources that the Compliance Assurance Committee has on their website that helps with the facilitation of a PROC. But also, I think it goes to reminding us, how do we operate our PROC? You know, what is the best way to do it? So I guess if we could just start out the slide deck. And if am I doing that from here? Or? I think I am. I'm like Jim Brackens. Let's see. Is it the bottom one? Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. So the questions we have here are what's worked, what didn't, and then, oh, jeez. And of course, the last question there is, how do we respond to the DOL report? And again, that really is probably a rhetorical question too. But I think from what we heard today from Jim Brackens and what we'll hear later from Alan, all is in response, I shouldn't say all, but a big part of it is in response to what's happened with the DOL report. And I think the undercurrent of that, the main message to me is, I think we have to be flexible. We have to be nimble enough to revise or maybe redo what we've done. And I know I'm from Montana, and talking to Linda Harris, who's here representing Montana with our PROC, the way we do things, we may have to rethink what we do in our state based on the changes that the AICPA is making with peer review, and also based on changes that state boards might have to make in monitoring peer review. So I think we have to ask ourselves, how do we respond to the DOL report? The thing I wanted Harry to remind me of, and I'll just mention it right now so I don't forget, because there's another slide which we may not get to, which really asks, what kind of discussions do you as a PROC have with peer reviewers? Do you have any kind of audience at all with your peer reviewers? Any kind of interaction that's not part of a monitoring process with your peer reviewers? And as I'm sitting listening to Colonel Ryan, I thought, wow, wouldn't that be a novel idea to have either a state board audience with peer reviewers or a PROC audience with peer reviewers to really give them the same type of discussion that Colonel Ryan just gave to us, to let them know that, yes, they're embattled, and they are. Those of you in the room who are peer reviewers know that you might feel a little pressure, you might feel a little embattled because of the report, and so a lot of the focus is on you, and of course we as regulators are really looking at that and focusing on them. But they are the ones, we need them. We're asking them to do this job for us. We need them to do this job for us. And so we need them to feel good about the process that they're performing for us. We need them to continue to have faith in the system and that they're a vital part of making the peer review process work. And I know I have some peer reviewers in my state that are getting out of the business, they say, because of the scrutiny that they're under, because they feel unappreciated and so on. And that's a shame. Now, as Jim would say, there's some that certainly need to go. You know, that's just the way it is. There's some peer reviewers that probably are long past their time, and we need new blood, and we need new ideas, and we all understand that. But there's also some good ones out there that maybe don't feel very appreciated. So, just a novel idea. Maybe there would be a forum where a state board could gather all the peer reviewers in the state or in some fashion and say, hey, look, guys, we appreciate what you do. Here's what we need you to do, and you're the ones to do it. and go forth and fight the good battle. And I don't know. I don't know if many may do that already. But listening to Colonel Ryan and getting charged up about it, maybe that's what we need to do with our peer reviewers. Anyway, thanks, Harry, for the reminder. Okay. All right. Okay. So as far as the Oversight Committee, well, there's 4 different topics we want to talk about. We want to talk about certainly the formation of a proc, and again, it'll run the gamut. So I'm going to ask some questions here as we go through when we start getting into the nuances of each of these categories, but it runs the gamut. I think the focus of your proc, I think, is very important. I think the monitoring procedures that you have are very important, and of course, what type of reports do you do? Okay, as far as the formation of the proc. So how many of you have a formal document which describes what the proc does? Do you have a mission statement, bylaws? How many have that? Okay, so probably about half of you. How many of you would say, well, we do have some kind of a formation or a formative guide, but it's informal? Would any of you say that you have that? Some do, you bet. And I think that would be where it's not maybe written in rule and maybe not in statute. How many of you have some kind of guidance, but it's not in statute or rule? Might even be just some kind of written document. Yep, and we do too. Compensation, expense reimbursement. How many of you compensate your proc members? Okay, there's a few. Okay. I heard this morning in Jim Giroux's session, I think, where Oklahoma, I think, compensates them as $150 an hour. And the comment was, wow, they're not getting paid very much. And some of us are going, oh, my God, that's a great fee. That's fantastic. What do you guys think about that? I mean, do you feel the need that you would want to compensate the proc members? Depends on state statutes, whether they get any compensation or not. Okay? Do some not pay them anything? It's just a volunteer thing. Okay? They're doing it for the profession, and they understand that, and they're good with that. Okay? Maybe. Loosely based. What's that? They're not good with it. Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay? How about the confidentiality agreement? How many of you have that? Now, do you have it for all your proc members? Is that okay? There's a good confidentiality agreement sample in the compliance assurance materials on the website, on the proc materials. It's a good, just a sample confidentiality agreement. One of the things that, for those of you who don't have a confidentiality agreement, was it a willful decision not to have something, or we just haven't thought that we needed it? Okay. If you answered, well, we had a thoughtful idea that we didn't need it, it might be because of the focus that you have in your proc, and we'll get to that here in a second. Your meeting frequencies. Those of you with a proc that have had an established proc, how many times do you meet? Just yell out a number. Quarterly? Quarterly? One time, once a year? When is it, Rick? When do you guys meet? The last board meeting, okay? Somebody else said once already, too? Monthly, meet monthly, okay? Is it as a committee, or do they meet with the board? Just the committee meets. When do you meet with your board? Do you ever? Okay, so your committee gets together you're the monthly one, right, Steve? So you guys get together monthly, and then when the board wants a report or an update, they'll say, can you please come to the board meeting and give us an update? Okay, so they expect that to happen. Okay, is that a good thing? For those of you that are state board members that maybe don't sit, are there any state board members here who do not currently sit on a proc? Okay. How do you get your information? I mean, have you sat through a presentation from a proc chair or anything in your board meetings yet?
We don't have a proc yet.
So you're just getting going. Okay. Same thing. Okay. Do we all think it's a good idea for the proc, if there are no state board members included on the chair or on the committee, to address the board? Is once a year enough? Is quarterly enough? Probably depends on the board. Okay. Okay. So those are all different things, and you can see that people do different things. Okay. All right. No, sorry. Okay, the composition. So we have a lot of different issues here. How big is your proc? 3 members? 2 members? In Montana, it's 2 members. 6 members. And what state are you from? New Jersey? Okay. All right. Is there an ideal number? Why 2? Rick, why 2?
Just seemed adequate given the quality of the state-sponsored program.
Okay.
They can change that, the engagement reviewer or the engagement plan person and the assistant plan, they can change that anytime there's a committee change or it appears to them it's not working effectively.
Okay. Okay. So they have some flexibility. Okay. How many of you have 1? Okay, we didn't want in Montana for a little bit. We had 1, elevated it to 2, doubled the size of the committee. Went to 2 because we felt it was necessary. But again, I think when we get into focus, that might say something about that. What about and Jim mentioned earlier in his session, you certainly want to have, or in fact, what he did is he showed some of the videos that are on the CAC website, which are excellent, by the way. So good job, committee, in putting those together. But it talked about the board composition and the terms, and the ideal way to go about it, particularly if you have multi-member procs, is the staggering of terms. So you have some continuity there, and that certainly is something that you'd want to have if you don't. What about the experience? Financial statement preparer, peer reviewer, state board member. How many have this kind of requirement for the formation of your procs? What do you have?
Audit or above.
What do you have? Audit?
Audit or above, and then
Okay.
have to be actively involved in audit. Plus, peer review has to be passed.
Okay, so they have to be an auditor. Have to be a peer reviewer. Did you say that? Or have to have gone through a peer review?
Have to gone through a peer review and be passed or above.
Okay, and have to have been pass or above. Okay. Have to have 2 peer reviewers of your 6. Okay. Is that vital? How many of you have a prohibition against state board members serving on your proc? I know there's some. Okay, Florida, Washington, New York, okay, Mississippi. Is that, what do you guys think about that? I mean, are those who don't have a prohibition, do you have state board members on your proc? Okay. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, do you think? Those who have made a prohibition of state board members serving on the proc, why is that? Why would you feel the need to restrict that?
Well, in New York, the state board would be responsible for disciplinary action, and they want to have no conflict of interest. They want to have separation of the whole process. So we do the oversight, they do the disciplinary action.
Okay. So obviously it's a deal where you want some separation, certainly, knowing what may come later. Okay? Same there. So for those of you who haven't made a prohibition, why do you feel it's okay for state board members to sit on the proc? Or why have you not made this prohibition? Was it because you haven't really thought of it? Janice?
No, but I know some states have state law that says if a board can't delegate to a non-board committee. So there has to be a state representative on the phone. I don't know how many states there are, but I know of at least one.
And I think Jim mentioned this morning, I think Ohio was in that boat too. You know, in Montana, both of the members of the PROC are state board members. And again, it's by design. And we'll get to that here in a second when we start talking about the focus. Because I think that's where you'll see some difference between what the various PROCs want to achieve. And again, as we go through this, there is no right or wrong answer, I feel, as long as you're consistent with what your focus is of your PROC. If your composition or the way you obtain members to your PROC isn't consistent with your focus, then I think you have a problem. But I think we all want to be clear in what the focus is. So, what are we overseeing? The administrative entity, oversight of the peer reviews. Certain procs, by design, are meant to oversee a process, while others might be more concerned with the participants in the process. So those of you with existing procs, what would you say your focus is? Is it to oversee the process, or is it to oversee maybe not only the process, but also the participants of the process? Now, when we put this slide deck together a couple years ago, times were different. And I think as we listened to Jim this morning, I think the focus of the AICPA certainly is more on the participants. But the way your existing procs are now, would you say your focus is more on the process or the participants in the process? Any volunteers with that? On process? Rick? Process?
And I would say neither, because the main thing that UDOC does is review only failed peer reviews.
So your proc comes into play when there's a failed peer review, then you take a look and say, what happened? Okay? So for you, you may not necessarily be, and I'm kind of leading you along here, but you're not so concerned with the process or reviewing the process. You're just the corroborator of the results of the peer review. Would that be fair? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Educational enhancement reviews?
That's what our committee does for CPA firms and only in conflict notice cases. They don't have to be peer reviewed. But they can be subject to a PDR of 5 years for the same.
Yeah. So you have a layer of reporting that's not included in peer review, and we did talk about that this morning. Montana did do that, and I know there's some other states that have Nebraska I think did, Dan, like a practice monitoring program, where we did the same thing, where for compilations and reviews, they could opt into an alternative state board-run monitoring system, and it was a practice monitoring program that we had. Then if it was an audit, they were thrown into peer review. Montana's now gone away from that, now requires peer review. I think Nebraska, didn't you guys, Dan? Has done the same thing. Now everybody's under peer review if they have certain levels of reporting, not to get into the SARS 21 stuff, but yeah, there are states that did that, and yeah, you bet. And our state board was the facilitator of that program and was very active in that program, and it was a very good learning experience for those of us on the state board that went through that to see what's out there, to see what crap is out there, and there was a lot. But I think this kind of leads us into what you want from your proc and the differences that there can be, because when I interviewed state boards a few years ago, it was very evident to me that some state boards were very much involved in overseeing the participants. You know, what were the qualifications of the peer reviewers? You know, what backgrounds did they have? They would actually look to see what kind of classes had been attended, much like what the AICPA is doing, has done then, and is doing now. And so when I started out and mentioned that our procs may have to change a little bit, to adapt a little bit to what's happening with the AICPA, in Montana anyway, we may have to rethink that and say, well, okay, now in the oversight process, do we need to look at what our administering entity is doing or what the AICPA is doing in looking at that peer reviewer, where before maybe we just relied on the process. That may be a change we have to make that we didn't have to do before. Okay. So then the monitoring. Okay, how do we do it? You know, what are we looking at? Janice mentioned the facilitated state board access mechanism, and I think that's excellent. That's a great way for procs to find out what's out there, and we want to encourage the use of that wherever possible. Information that you can receive directly from your society or administering entity. There's a lot of it there. This is where we in Montana relied on, is to get these materials, because our philosophy at the time certainly was the AICPA is doing a lot of monitoring already. If we had a good feeling for what our society was doing in overseeing the peer review process, And if we had faith in what the AICPA was doing, this is what we wanted to have. Now, is that faith shaken? I hope not, but maybe. Okay, and that's where we may have to adapt again with what the procs are doing and what our focus has been. But would be what you'd want. These are the types of things that I think you'd want to get. Now, if you looked at this list, is this the type of items that you're getting either at a state board level, at a proc level? Just a show of hands, are you guys aware of these type of information that's out there? Nods, I guess people are generally aware of that. There's some good information there that I think you can get to find out what monitoring has there been already. That maybe the burden isn't solely on you, that the AICPA has done some of that, and you would hope would be very diligent about it, and they are. I can tell you in our state, we had a lot of faith in that the AICPA was, because I had some of my partners who are peer reviewers and many who sat on our peer review committee for our society, and I knew what they had to go through when the AICPA guys were in town to oversee the process and how they sat in on those sessions and questioned some decisions made through the RAB. So I think these are materials that I think are good to get. Okay. How about the second bullet there, the review of a list of firms that are scheduled for peer review and comparing it to the reports that the administering entity received. How many of you do that type of thing, that kind of analytical comparison? You guys do it. Okay, in what state? Oklahoma. Okay, you guys are doing that right now. Any others? Mississippi? I'll get to you, Jimmy. So what would be the benefit that you guys find? Have you found where there are some discrepancies?
Yeah, there can be in some of the reports that have been held over or whatever, but our system, we look at who's coming up to be due to a peer review, and then we look at the FSBA to see who underwent the peer review to match those up.
Okay. And so that gives you a good feeling that everybody who should be having a peer review is. Janice? Yeah, and I wish I could, I'm trying to get this thing on here, but I'm not smart enough. Let's see here. Because it's not, is it on? Is it on the bottom? Well, that's the one, let's see. Is it on the bottom, or is it? What's that? Talk to my tie? Talk to my tie. I'm sorry. No, I'm an idiot. That's the problem. So, thank you. Thanks.
Yes, I'm with Oklahoma. Okay.
Thank you.
Is we use the FSBA in conjunction with our internal database, which tells us based on the previous report when the peer review is due. So those peer reviews appear on my task list, so to speak, and then I compare that with the reports that have been accepted to the FSBA, and sum those two together, and we've been fortunately to work out where they match up. Who's supposed to have a peer review? But yes, there may be some discrepancies that are accounted for, but that's how we do it.
Thank you. Say, Jimmy, I'm going to come your way. I guess if you could just describe, and really, the main question I'd have for you is if you guys have found any discrepancies in what you're looking at.
Well, we get the report from the administrative entity listing of all the firms that's scheduled for peer review, and then the reports that we receive, and then we have discrepancies. Always have discrepancies, and then what we do is follow up with the discrepancies with the firms to find out why we have a discrepancy.
Why has that been? What's their reason?
Do I have to answer?
No.
Yeah, most of the time we hear the same thing Jim Bracken's talking about this morning, in process.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. So I think this would be a good thing if you're not doing it in your state, not a bad analytical tool, and those of us who are auditors like that kind of thing. But I think, would this have discovered maybe some of the issues that occurred in the last year? I don't know, but it's a mechanism we have. The next bullet there, the interviews of the peer reviewers, and this is where I wanted to remind myself to reference Colonel Ryan's discussion, and I thought I'd forget. But again, how many of you have any kind of one-to-one interviews with peer reviewers? And it might even be, tell us what you do, tell us how you think the process works, that type of thing. Do any of you do that? Do you think there might be value in that? Again, going right to the participants in the program to say, how is it working? Do you see any cracks? Are there any breaks in the system that might make it difficult for you to get a report out? You know, we had this discussion yesterday in talking amongst ourselves about some of our administering entities being overburdened to where it takes forever to get a report out. And maybe a participant in the program, meaning a peer reviewer, might relay that information to us and say, you know, we got a great process, great program, but it takes so long to get our reports through the system, which gets to be frustrating. And those of you who are peer reviewers know that adds stress and strain when you're trying to get reports out and you're going back and forth with the society and so on. So that might not be a bad option to have. How about participating in the peer review committee meetings or the RAB meetings? So those of you who are on procs that have existing procs, let me ask, do you participate in the peer review committee meetings? Okay, you do. Okay. Let me just ask you if I can pick on you. What would be your participation? What's your level of participation?
Well, this is Texas, and we get the same material that all the RAB members get ahead of time. We have an opportunity to read it, do some risk assessment as to which ones we want to focus on, sit in on the meetings, participate, but not vote on outcomes,
Okay.
but fully interact with all the members of the RAB. And we do that at every session at which there is a RAB, either in person or on the phone.
Now, are you a state board member?
No, we don't have state board members on the Review Oversight Committee.
Okay. And I would think it's probably goes without saying, but I would suspect you have a confidentiality agreement that you sign. Okay. Okay. Who else sits in on the RAB? New Jersey, right?
Since we have, in New Jersey, since we have two peer reviewers on the PROC, those two are excluded, and only another person does the actual RAB interviews and sits on the phone calls, is allowed to participate, respond, and give their own thoughts. They also go visit the society and go through the procedures. So it's really a process, and interviewing, it's almost like doing a mini walkthrough of the system. But the peer reviewers are excluded from doing that process. What's that? The state board member is right in the room here.
If I might just add, one of the reasons that a state board member, that you might not want to have state board members sit on the peer review oversight committee, is because they might hear or see information that would put them in a position that they would have to recuse themselves if that firm were to come before the board for hearing. So really having your state board members, now some statutes require it, so you can't get around it, but the model is really that your peer review oversight committee be made up of non-state board members. And I know New Jersey, I've talked with a couple of people from New Jersey, and I understand why it was done that way, and they've worked around it. Their two board members don't participate in all of the meeting. But that is the reason that in the guidance that is in the handbook that the AICPA has, and also in our information that the Compliance Assurance Committee has put together, we really don't recommend that it be a board member, simply because you now could have put those board members in a position that they cannot be sitting members on a case.
Thanks, Janice. Jim, I'm going to put you, where's Jim Giroux? I want to, and not really put you on the spot, but I'm gonna. But you had mentioned something in your earlier session about what Ohio does, which frankly is very much what Montana does. And so you do have state board members.
Well, by statute, our peer review oversight are board members. So what we have is basically an individual who monitors the RABs and reports back to us on those types of things, and we look at the we look at the reports, the oversight reports and things like that to develop our understanding of what's going on. In addition to that, we bring in the AE for a subcommittee meeting, and they make a presentation to the subcommittee members on there. Now, in our situation, though, if I were to attend a RAB session in our situation, and we have 9 members on the board, so if one member recuses themselves, there's still 8 other members. Or if somebody, maybe from our investigative staff, is oversighting or stuff like that, they would be removed or not participate in the investigation. So we're staffed in a situation where I think we're covered for that. And we're still trying to, I'm still trying to get my arms around in the development of a more working PROC and taking the burden off of just one person attending the RABs.
No, thanks. That's excellent. I can tell you with in Montana, with our 2 members of the state board who are on the PROC, they attend the RAB meeting, but just through the training. So they'll sit in on the committee and the RAB meeting for the RAB training that they do each year. And then they'll, of course, submit a report to the state board on that. But that's where we then rely on all those other documents that we referred to earlier, the oversight that the AICPA conducts, who are in there looking at the actual peer review reports and those issues. And so, and again, for us, number one, we felt that was the process that worked best for us, and it's a manpower thing as well. But
Rick, what I want to point out as a part of this is where another difficulty that can come out with a state board member being observing the RAB is Janice is right, they may have to recuse themselves, but frankly, in some cases, they have a conflict, and if they observe a situation where professional standards are violated by a firm, they have a responsibility as a board member for turning into investigations. That's why from the AICPA standards, we have the confidentiality agreement. So we say unless you sign a confidentiality agreement, you're not going to get those work papers, prior to the meeting. There is one state where, in essence, they can't sign that, and we say, okay, I mean, they're not state board members, but even the PROC, they have to go to the state society's office. They can sit there and look at them during the meeting. They can't take them anywhere. They're not allowed to because they can't sign a confidentiality agreement. So, it's a catch-22. So that's another reason for a state board member. They can't really sign a confidentiality agreement because they've got another responsibility on the board to be turning that over. So there's a lot of issues with it. So, I know, respect Ohio, how they worked around it, and that's why I made the point about New Jersey. They've got a board member, but they don't participate in that, so they don't have that problem.
well, thanks.
But I will say, I actually think it's very important that the PROC observes the RAB process. So.
Oh, yeah. Well, and again, for us, they participate in the training, but then they're out of the room. And just because we understand those conflicts. And but again, I bring that up just to let you know there's some spectrum there. And whether that works for your state or those who are just developing your PROC, there's different ways to go depending on what your focus is and maybe what your resources might be. Tools and documentation. How many of you in your PROCs, when you report back to your state boards, because we're all assuming that you do at some point, and hopefully your state boards are asking for that if it's not part of your normal process, how do you do it? How many do a narrative summary? Anybody? How many of you do the checklist? Are you aware, those who have an existing PROC, of the checklists that are listed on the Compliance Assurance Committee website? Everybody's pretty aware of those. Are you using those? Okay. Is anybody not aware of those? Okay. I think if you sat through Jim's session earlier, I think Jim took you through that. Maybe in Mark's might have done the same thing in his session. They're great tools. The committee put those together as a way to at least have some mechanism for reporting back to the state boards. And a lot of those are on process, you know, and they're very general questions, and yet it gets to the monitoring of the process. You know, was there open discussion? It seemed like all members had a chance to voice their opinion? Was there good weighing of the opinions of the members and so on? I think so. It's a good mechanism to have some documentation for your oversight of that process. Okay, we kind of covered this again with that level of participation, whether as an observer or an active participant. In Texas, you're very much of an active participant. In other states, I would suspect many of you may be active participants, where others might just be observers. How many of you would consider your participation in a RAB meeting as being an observer? Okay. How many of you would say you're an active participant? Okay, so you have the you run. Okay, so in Texas then as an active participant, and you mentioned a little bit ago that you're right in the discussion, but you don't vote.
We get the same material that each of the RAB members get, and we determine through some risk assessment which ones we're going to dig into more deeply within that RAB. But then as each RAB member presents their selection of peer reviews, we participate in the discussion. In most cases, we read all the material, perhaps less in depth than some that we were more interested in through risk assessment. But we offer our comments, ask questions. If there's some question about what kind of report should attach, we offer our opinions about that. In some cases, challenge the answer and listen to the vote. To make sure, as you referred to the questionnaire, was there a good, robust discussion? Was the presenter well prepared? Do we agree with the conclusion or not, whether we vote or not? But we have input into that as we go through.
Let me ask you, how many are all the PROC members participating like you do? And you have how many on your?
We have three
So three?
PROC members, and typically we have 3 RABs.
Okay.
When we have a full meeting.
Okay.
If it's a telephone meeting, there are generally 2 RABs at different times of day, and a PROC member is listening in and participating in the telephone sessions as well.
So not all 3 at the same time. You might split it up.
Right.
Okay, and in the composition of your procs, you would, I think, if I recall you correctly, I think you have certain qualifications to serve on the proc.
You need to be a peer reviewer. You have those qualifications to be a peer reviewer, qualifications to be on the peer review committee, and still in active public practice.
Okay, so you have certain things that would lend itself to you being an active participant and knowing how the process works.
Correct.
Okay. Jim, is that kind of okay? Okay. How about those of you who were on a proc? How many of you received specific training to be on a proc other than maybe this? Okay. Okay. How many of you would like specific training, maybe other than this, to feel that you're doing what you need to do as a proc member? Do many of you feel, or does any of you feel, that yeah, I like the proc, I'm getting a lot out of this, but I'd like to know more to feel good about what I'm doing? Is there anybody like that? Okay, that's an honest response, and thank you. And certainly put that on your evaluation sheet, because certainly NASBA, I think, would want to respond to that, but also I think in your state boards. I think we need to know that if we're going to have this oversight responsibility, ask ourselves, what kind of training do we need? If we're not peer reviewers, if we're not haven't served on the peer review committee for our state society or administering entity, what things do I need to know in order to fill that role? And hopefully you're getting some of that here today, but there might be other things that you feel you want to know. And I thank you for your honest response, because I think I certainly would feel the same way. What's that?
What I found out of this meeting is how much I don't know.
Yeah, and that's good. That's a good byproduct of this meeting. That's excellent. Thanks. How many of you get any kind of resistance from your state society in your participation? Anybody? The food that you eat. Yeah, well, I get it. I understand that. Yeah, Janice.
You know, we sent all of our PROC members when they became a PROC member the first time. The board paid for them to attend the peer review training course. So that if they weren't already peer reviewing, didn't have that insight, the board paid for them to go there.
I think that's excellent. And I think your administering.
I know that training is going to be changing, it's going to be web-based, might even be easier for them to get that training.
I think it's a great idea, and I think your administering entity probably appreciates it as well. You know, if I'm them and I have somebody who's overseeing my process, I'd certainly want them to understand the process. And if they sat through the training, that would tell me they have a good idea of how that training works. Yes?
From the AE side, we have made that available free to the PROC members to attend because our rules require at least 2 people on the PROC to have gone through the training. And from the society side, we pushed that because we wanted qualified people on the PROC. So we've been offering it, we've just offered it for free.
Okay.
Oregon.
Hang on. I want to ask you a question. What, as an administering entity, what benefits have you received? Any benefit do you feel from PROC members being involved or providing that oversight?
We've gone through a dry spell the past year or 2 with the PROC and not attending, but the benefit of having them come to the meetings, it eliminated the mystery behind the process. There was this distrust because they didn't really understand the process and the concern of the good old boy network, and that especially the committee members were looking out for each other because we're small, and so we don't have separate RAB and separate committee. It's all one. So that kind of it was, everyone who attended was very impressed with the process and walked away feeling better. So that's the benefit to us.
So have you gotten any new ideas or anything from feedback or interaction that they might have presented? No. Okay. Well, that might be a useful byproduct at some day in the future, hopefully, where from those who are overseeing the process to provide that independent feedback. Anyway, thank you very much for that. Okay. Okay, then reporting. Who do we report to? So of your PROCs that you have, all of you, I'm assuming, report to your state board. Again, maybe annually, maybe quarterly, maybe month, or, well, even not monthly, but it would be at request. Do any of you sit on a PROC where, yeah, we do this, but our state board has never really asked us to come to their meeting or really let them know what happens? Anybody in that boat? Hate to have you throw your state board under the bus, but just asking the question. Anybody have that issue? I hope not. Good, because it makes it. I guess it seems that there's at least some mechanism or some schedule that you would adhere to report your findings, which is good. How many of you report to the state legislature? Anybody? Does your state board have that obligation to report results of the peer review process? And I assume nobody's meeting with the governor to go over that process. Okay. And maybe that's a good thing, that we don't want to encourage that. Rick, what's that? I do. You probably have a weekly meeting with your governor on a myriad of issues. Okay, so you're on the hot seat. So, Well, that's probably why we wouldn't want to, but that's an interesting thing, and maybe, I was curious to see if this answer might change from what it has in past years, just because of maybe the scrutiny the profession has received, but it might just be not as widespread outside of our profession, where our legislators might have some interest other than if they're in a larger active state like Washington, California, Texas, and that type of thing. Do you ever provide the report to the society or the administering entity? So in Oregon, does your proc provide you with a copy of their report? Okay, okay. Okay. How about the rest of you? Do you provide your report to the state society? You do? Okay, okay. So there really aren't any surprises to them? Okay, yes?
For the state of Louisiana, every time there's a RAB meeting, we get a report soon thereafter from whichever PROC member attended or participated in that meeting. And the state board staff consolidates those reports in addition to presenting them at state board meetings. We consolidate them in a table, and they eventually get into minutes and on our website for public review. So the public actually gets, and we keep prior years a summary of how many engagements, a review, how many system reviews, how many passed with the, I mean, all that statistical information is in our minutes, and so therefore it's open to the public. I mean, they get it in some
So
way.
they're getting it like everybody else in the public is getting it, right? Okay. Has there been any issues at all where they'd say, hey, I didn't expect this, this isn't exactly right? All right.
I'm going to take this minute for an editorial comment. And I'm
I'm sorry, we're fresh out of time. So,
and I'm speaking as chairman of NASBA Enforcement Committee. I think, and Jim, you'll recognize this too, that when peer review started, 37 years ago, it was in response to government pressure that we had just suffered a major breakdown in confidence, I think, from the savings and loans debacle, I think. But the compromise through the ICPA was peer review, and as an educational tool only. And I think what we're all seeing now, with all the state boards requiring peer review, that has become a regulatory issue also and an enforcement issue. One of the reasons I think it's necessary to have procs is I think we're going to see some legal action coming down the pike if a state puts somebody on probation or removes their license because of a bad peer review, and you can't support the state position and say that, well, we relied on the membership committee or membership institution to remove this guy's license. I think we're at risk as NASBA because of this, and I think the procs, it's critical for every state to start getting a proc so that they can sustain a legal battle if necessary if they take somebody's license because of bad peer reviews. I think we're getting to a position now where we need to start looking more and more as this is not an educational situation, and the state boards have to be starting to become way, way, way more involved in the enforcement action and regulatory action. And the ICPA and NASBA are working closely, working closer to get to this point. But the confidentiality thing that we keep running into, I think, is probably about 15 years too late now. And we need to start encouraging that way, way, way more with the ICPA. And sorry, Jim, I'm throwing you under the bus now, but it's a problem. It really becomes a problem with the committees, with NASBA and with our regulation when we can't find a bad peer reviewer and we can't find bad people out there for 6 years and they're out there doing bad things. So,
no,
editorial comment.
No, I appreciate that, Harry. And just to add a little bit, not necessarily specific to that, but in Montana, Linda and I were talking about this the other night. In Montana, our administering entity is looking to get out of the business, if you will, of it being our society is getting out of the business of being the administering entity, because they feel that the changes that are occurring in peer review are such that it now doesn't fit the mission. You know, the mission of the society being a benefit to the members and education to the members and enhancement of the members, to where now where they see and they're not opposed to this. They're very responsive and receptive and work well with the board, and yet they feel that the change is such that they're not sure they want to be part of that process because of the regulatory nature of it, which is an interesting thing, but that's what we're dealing with here.
I want to echo Harry's comments. I specialize in keeping companies out of bankruptcy, and for the first time 2 years ago, I was asked to liquidate a $28 billion non-depository trust, and the U.S. Attorney's Office and the state regulator specifically asked me to identify any problems with the auditors, their peer review process, and if there were any regulatory bodies who were negligent in the exercise of their responsibility of the accounting profession. And that's happened now 3 times in the past 2 years.
Yeah, it's a very real issue that we're having to deal with. Add some complications, certainly. The last bullet there, the type of information report, and you alluded to it, I think, in your state, where you do present all the statistics and the analysis of the different reports, peer review reports that occurred. And there's some excellent, sample or template reports in the CAC website, which will help you put together that type of information. I'm not sure if that's what the format that you use. You probably have your own format that you guys follow, which maybe is the one where the CAC got their template. But it's a great template. Presents a lot of information that occurred for the past year on that. And this might be, I guess that's it. I guess I'd like to close because I think it's just about that time. Is there anybody who would like to offer up, in the interest of sharing, what maybe your proc does that if you had a choice, you wouldn't do now? Or you would advise others who are just now establishing a proc to avoid? Anything like that? All right, that's great. And again, a lot of people doing a lot of different things, but happy with what they're doing. And again, if it's still consistent with your focus, who can argue with that? If you start deviating from your focus, then I think that's where you'd want to look at yourself and maybe make some change. And it's probably always good to annually look at what you do and what you're trying to achieve with your proc and what you're looking to oversee. But at any rate, thanks for your participation and your willingness to share. Thank you.